Snow began to fall in the late afternoon. Not the soft, feather-like flakes, but thick, heavy snow, cold as shards of stone tumbling from a gray sky. The wind howled through the black pine trees, twisting like a wild animal that had lost its way. Deep in the Adirondack Mountains, wind and snow did not come to play. They came to bury everything in the silence of a white death. Richard sat alone by the fireplace in the small wooden cabin he had built himself 3 years ago, after leaving the military. After losing everything, his old sweater was frayed at the shoulders. The hunting rifle hung by the hearth like a quiet reminder that the world outside was still dangerous. But inside this cabin, everything was so quiet it almost choked the breath. No voices, no engine hum, just the soft crackle of wood splitting under the heat of the flames. 3 years ago, Richard was a Marine Corps sergeant, stone-faced, spine straight like a steel rod in the K9 unit in Syria. 3 years ago, Kaiser, his loyal dog, never came back. An explosion, a report, a letter of condolence. And from that moment on, Richard never came back either. He left the unit, cut off all contact, refused to meet with comrades, disconnected the internet, stopped answering mail, and eventually, vanished from the map like a man already dead. He chose the mountains, chose the cold, chose solitude, chose a life without past, without future, only the present. With the sound of burning wood and the beating of his own heart each morning he still woke. That night, the temperature dropped to -24°C. Richard loaded the fireplace one last time, then sat down, eyes fixed on the wooden wall, where no memory hung. Until the knock came. 3 beats, then silence. There couldn't be anyone, not in this kind of weather. Richard slowly stood, reaching behind him. The Glock 19 was still there. He released the safety, stepped toward the door, eyes locked on the small peephole he had carved into the wood. Darkness. But then, he heard it. A whine, faint, hidden beneath the wind, and the sound of claws tapping lightly on the wooden steps. No, it couldn't be. Richard's heart clenched. Instinctively, he opened the door, just wide enough to block the harsh wind. Just enough for something, or someone, to step inside. And then he saw them. 3 snow-covered silhouettes, panting, eyes glowing in the darkness. 3 Malinois dogs in tattered military gear, smeared with mud and dried blood. The first, back straight, ears perked, standing at attention, looked at Richard as if it had known him from another life. It growled softly, then stepped aside, giving way to the second, badly injured in the right shoulder. Limping with every step, the third came last, eyes darting, always guarding the rear, like a silent bodyguard. Richard stood frozen. His hand dropped the gun. He knelt down, extending his hand toward the wounded one. And in that very moment, the eyes of the first locked onto his. That exact gaze. Rex. He whispered the name like a prayer spilling from a soul long since dead. Rex didn't react, but that gaze needed no response. 3 years, ice, silence, all melted in a single look. 3 war dogs, Rex, Kaiser, Bruno, had found the right man, at the right time. Richard opened the door wider. "Come in, boys," he said. The wind howled behind them. But inside the cabin, the flames suddenly roared, as if a new battle was just beginning. Rex entered first. No command, no call. He glided past Richard as if he had lived here before. As if he knew exactly where the rug was, where the fireplace stood, and who the man in front of him truly was. Bruno followed, more cautiously. His eyes scanned every corner, like a sentry who never stood down. He stopped near the door, sat down, but never took his eyes off the night sky outside, where snowflakes still fell like blades. Kaiser, the most pitiful of the 3, dragged himself in. 1 step at a time. Every step left a small drop of blood on the wooden floor. His eyes were bloodshot, not from aggression, but sheer exhaustion. Richard knelt down, slipped his hands beneath Kaiser's trembling body, lifting him gently. For a moment, an image flashed in his mind. A night in Syria, a mine blast, the same dog, just 10 months old, cradled in his arms like this. Now, a seasoned warrior, still returning to the same man when bleeding. Oh God, Kaiser? There was no time to dwell. Richard laid Kaiser down on the rug near the fireplace, rummaged through an old military med kit he'd kept, not just out of habit or precaution, but deep down, because he had never truly let go. He cleaned the wound with warm water, wiped away the clotted blood with gauze, then quickly administered a battlefield dose of antibiotics. The gash was deep, but it hadn't hit an artery. Kaiser would live, if infection didn't set in. As he worked, Richard realized, these weren't ordinary dogs. Every movement, every glance, showed the mark of elite military training. Without a word, Rex had begun patrolling the perimeter of the cabin. Bruno stayed at the door, ears upright no matter how the wind howled. Kaiser, even in pain, hadn't let anyone touch Rex before he made it inside. They were a team, a unit, and they had been sent here with intent. Richard sat down, staring at the 3 war dogs. Rex now lay by the fire, eyes flicking to Kaiser, then turning to look straight at Richard. And in that brief moment, Richard saw something unmistakably human in that gaze. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't fear. It was a message. We've made it. Now it's your turn. Richard leaned back against the chair, took a deep breath. His mind buzzed with questions he couldn't yet answer. Why had they come here? Who trained them? What had happened? And most of all, why him? Suddenly, Bruno gave a sharp bark. Short, precise, like a signal. Richard flinched. It wasn't a bark of alarm. Bruno wanted him to look. Rex stood up, walked over to Kaiser, where the digitized military vest still clung to his body. Richard knelt again. With trembling hands, he opened a small side pouch on Rex's vest, and pulled out a cold, metallic object. A USB. Attached to it was a tag. Delivered to Colonel Marcus Hayes, Fort Drum. Richard's heart pounded. That name, Fort Drum, Hayes, all part of a past he had tried to bury. His last commanding officer. The man who once said to him, "If the day ever comes when it all falls apart, you'll be our final anchor." Richard looked up. Rex stared back, unblinking. Bruno returned to position at the door. Kaiser's breathing slowed, stabilized, and somewhere, in the sound of the wind cutting through the cabin's wooden walls, Richard could swear he heard a whisper. Marines are never decommissioned, just waiting for the call. The call had come. As the sun dipped behind the snow-covered pines, Richard remained still in front of the fireplace, his hand clutching the icy USB like it was a fragment of memory risen from the ashes. The 3 dogs, Rex, Bruno, and Kaiser, had fallen asleep. But not deeply. It was the kind of rest only creatures of war understood, one ear listening, one eye open, bodies still, but minds ready to rise in an instant. Richard looked at the USB again. No logo, no barcode, just a gray metallic shape, dull and cold, as if forged from silence and secrecy. Attached to it was the single instruction. Hand-delivered to Colonel Marcus Hayes, Fort Drum. Fort Drum. He hadn't heard that name in 3 years. It had been 3 years since Kaiser, the dog he believed to be dead, vanished with the entire unit during an op along the northern border. They told Richard he couldn't return. They told him he should rest. But now Kaiser was lying on the rug inside his home. Rex was guarding the door. And Bruno still watched his every move with eyes that seemed to remind him. This isn't a dream. This is an order. Richard stood, walked to the table, and pulled from the bottom drawer an old military device. A handheld satellite tracker he had long hidden away. Unused because there was nothing left to track. He connected the battery cord and waited for the blinking light to turn green. When the screen booted up, he typed in a string of security codes he thought he had forgotten. Within a minute, a signal from Fort Drum appeared, weak, but clear. He sent a brief encrypted message. 3K9 units have reached safe location. Possess item ID code X-ray. Request confirmation. 11 minutes later, a reply pinged, like a heartbeat pulsing through the silence. Hold position. Do not open device. Do not leave cabin. Retrieval team inbound in 48H. Hayes. Richard collapsed into the chair. For the first time in 3 years, someone had called him by a single letter. A soldier's signature. An order. A signal that he hadn't been completely forgotten. And behind that simple message lay 1,000 unspoken questions. How had 3 war dogs made it here? What was happening at Fort Drum? And why had he, the man who walked away from it all, been chosen to safeguard a device that could shift the balance? Rex stood. No sound. No reason needed. He walked straight to the door and sat down, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Richard followed his gaze and felt it. A change in air pressure. Not wind, but a sensation. A feeling soldiers knew all too well. The breath of danger. He jumped up, pulling his Glock 19 from the wooden wall slot. Bruno was already on his feet, his eyes hard as steel. Kaiser remained down, but his eyes were open, head lifted. And then, a faint sound echoed from the depths of the forest. Not a wolf, not a deer, but the unmistakable cadence of human footsteps. A shadow flicked past the edge of his vision. Near the tree line, swift, silent, and carrying no light, Richard backed away and whispered, "We're being watched." Bruno growled low. Rex stayed locked onto the western horizon. And in Richard's palm, the USB seemed to grow heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. His return wasn't a choice. It was a summons from the dark. And these 3 four-legged warriors had carried it all the way. To his doorstep. The sun had not yet risen. The snow had stopped, but the cold still stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. Richard sat by the window, one hand gripping his Glock, the other cradling a tin cup of thick black coffee. Rex lay close by his feet, eyes still scanning the misty forest. Bruno occasionally circled the cabin in silence. Kaiser, still breathing steadily. But Richard knew. He needed to be seen by a military vet, soon. Outside the cabin, silence lay like a burial shroud. Until the sound of footsteps gently pressing into the snow rang out, this time no longer evasive. Someone was approaching, directly from the front. No sneaking, no concealment. Richard held his breath and signaled Rex to stay down. He stepped onto the porch, his gun tucked under his coat. And then he saw her. A woman in a military coat. Collar adorned with a special insignia, the emblem of the Military Counterintelligence Bureau. Brown hair tied back, a face carved in ice. Eyes sharp as a blade honed on stone. She raised her hands to shoulder height. Unarmed. "I'm Captain Sarah Winters. I know who you are. Sergeant Richard. I didn't come to harm you, only to confirm that the 3K9 units have reached the right man." Richard didn't move a muscle. "What are you doing here alone? In a snowstorm, in the middle of the mountains? Far from any checkpoint?" Sarah gave a brief smile, not warm, but not fake. "I tracked Rex. He left a faint trail only combat-trained personnel could follow. I know this cabin. I know you. And I know the USB in your coat pocket. The real question is, have you opened it?" Richard froze. Rex stepped forward, standing between them, eyes locked on Sarah, not barking, but ready to leap if Richard gave the signal. Richard drew his Glock, raised it from beneath his coat. Barrel aimed squarely at Sarah's chest. "One more step and I shoot. Now talk. Who are you really? Counterintelligence? Or the one who made these 3 dogs flee the base?" Sarah raised her hands higher. Voice lowered. "You think it didn't hurt to see Kaiser near death? That I didn't worry when Bruno went dark? That I didn't cry when Rex sent his first distress signal 3 days ago? I used to lead the Omega K9 program. I designed the final mission they never completed. And I cast the final vote that chose you." Silence fell between the 3 of them. Richard lowered the gun, not because he fully believed her, but because in her eyes he saw something he had once seen in the mirror 3 years ago. Guilt, grief, and an order left unfinished. He opened the door. "Come in. But you don't give orders here." Sarah stepped inside. The cabin suddenly felt too small for 4 beings who had lived and died for missions. Bruno emerged from the shadows. Kaiser lifted his head. Sarah knelt beside Kaiser. Her eyes welled with tears. Her hands trembled slightly. She whispered, "I'm sorry, baby boy. I got here too late." On the table, Richard placed the USB. Sarah looked at it, then at him. "You haven't opened it, have you?" "I follow orders. I don't open anything I'm not authorized to touch." Sarah nodded. "Good, because inside isn't just evidence. It's something that could set half the world on fire if it ends up in the wrong hands." That night, deep in the forest cabin, while the fire roared and everyone else finally found brief rest, Sarah whispered to Richard, "We don't have much time. Someone is looking for the USB. And they already know about this place." Richard turned to Rex, the dog lying like a stone statue. Eyes still open, ears still listening. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard spoke, his voice low and steady like when he once commanded a unit. Then, it's time we split the team. Dawn rose slowly over the Adirondack Mountains. The snow lay thick like a white blanket. The first rays of light brought no warmth, only sharpened the sense of isolation surrounding the cabin in a sea of ice. But inside, the small cabin had transformed into a temporary operations room, where 3 four-legged beings, 2 humans with military pasts, and a USB containing national secrets were all awaiting a decision. Richard spread a map across the wooden table, marking key positions with old bullets. Sarah stood across from him, her eyes no longer cold, but piercing, as if her memory was rewinding through every stage of a mission erased from official records. Fort Drum is the destination. But we can't go together. Too exposed. If they could track Rex, then this cabin is no longer safe. Sarah said, I'm not taking Kaiser across that distance. Richard objected. He won't survive 70 miles through ice and snow. Sarah nodded, then pulled from her coat pocket a teardrop-shaped nano tracker. This is the backup key. If I fail, the USB won't be useless. But only this device matches its encryption. I'll carry the USB. You keep the nano key. Richard silently accepted it. Something stirred within him, not fear, but something he thought he'd left behind on that foreign border long ago. Duty. Bruno stepped forward, light as a winter gust. He stopped at Sarah's side, no command needed. Rex sat beside Richard, unmoving. Kaiser still lay near the fireplace, eyes blinking softly, ears alert, but his body couldn't take many more miles. Sarah bowed slightly, placing her hand on Bruno's head. He'll protect me to the end. But if I don't return within 72 hours, use Rex. Richard understood. That wasn't just an order, it was a farewell that might never be taken back. 72 hours, he said. After that, I'll get Rex and Kaiser to Fort Drum my way, even if I have to burn this forest down. At parting, Sarah stepped out of the cabin, the snow up to her knees. Bruno followed behind, never once looking back. Richard stood on the porch, watching the 2 figures shrink into the white expanse. Rex stood beside him, eyes locked ahead, silent as a stone sentinel. Only 3 remained. Richard, the soldier once rejected. Kaiser, the wounded warrior. And Rex, the silent lieutenant, carrying memories no human could ever comprehend. Richard turned back inside and shut the door. But in his mind, a plan was forming, a detour through a rocky canyon, down toward the town of Haven's End, where an old military signal post might still be operational, if it hadn't been decommissioned. He knew, if Sarah failed, if the USB fell into the wrong hands, the entire Omega K9 program, and everything Rex, Bruno, and Kaiser had ever fought for, would be wiped from existence. That night, when Rex nestled his head against Richard's wrist like a child seeking warmth, Richard no longer felt like a guardian. He had returned, not as a veteran, but as a soldier awaiting the call to act. And this time, he would not retreat, not when creatures more loyal than most humans had placed their lives entirely in his hands. The next morning, the sky remained as gray as cold ash. The snow had piled so high that Richard had to push the door open with his shoulder just to step outside. He carefully wrapped Kaiser in a thermal bag, then lifted him up, as if cradling a piece of his own past. Rex walked beside him, no leash required. Every step the dog took matched Richard's stride, like it had been programmed long ago. Between them, there was no need for commands, no need for words, only a look was enough. Richard knew the direct route to Fort Drum would be faster, but it was also the route most likely to be ambushed by those hunting for the USB. So he chose another path, a decommissioned military transport tunnel, abandoned since the 1980s, cutting through the Rocky Canyon near the Canadian border. A place where no GPS worked, no signal escaped, and a place where, he once thought he'd bury himself for good. They reached the tunnel's mouth at dusk. No signposts, no official entry, just a snow-covered stone wall and a rusted metal door so blended into the landscape. It looked like no human had touched it in years. Richard knelt, setting Kaiser down beside the entrance. From his pack, he pulled out a set of old Special Forces lock tools. He flipped the mechanical latch and slipped his hand into a narrow gap. A soft click echoed, breaking nearly a decade of silence. The door creaked open, revealing a cold, dark world below, one that had once held men, missions, blood, and vows. Rex didn't hesitate. He stepped in first, as if he still remembered every inch of this place. Richard smiled faintly. You know this place better than I do. Huh? Kaiser whimpered softly, eyes half closed. Richard lifted him and followed Rex inside. The tunnel opened into a maze of cold steel and silence, with narrow corridors descending like veins into the earth. Richard moved slowly, guided by a headlamp. The air reeked of old metal and dampness. But deeper still, there was the scent of memory. In a central chamber long abandoned, Richard laid Kaiser down and sparked a small fire with a field-grade thermal igniter. He looked around. Scrawled messily on one rusted wall were the words, "Omega Unit is never alone." Below it, the symbol, 3 claws slashed across a star, the insignia of the top-secret K-9 unit Richard once served. A unit the Pentagon never officially acknowledged. That night, sitting by the fire with Rex, Richard unfolded the map once more. Only 3 days remained before Sarah's 72 hours expired. He didn't want to believe she had failed. But he also understood the rules of the battlefield. If there's no signal, assume capture or death. Suddenly, Rex sprang to his feet, ears up. A sound, barely audible. But he caught it. Richard held his breath. The faint scrape of metal against stone. Then a flicker of weak flashlight beams from the west corridor. Not Sarah. Not Fort Drum personnel. Someone else had entered. Rex growled low. He didn't wait for a command. Richard slid his weapon from beneath his coat, raising it toward the sound. His heartbeat pounded like it had during those ambush nights in Kandahar. But this time, he wasn't fighting for orders. He was fighting for a promise. To those who had never betrayed him. Footsteps echoed from the western corridor, light but steady. Unhurried, unafraid. The kind of stride from someone who either belonged in the dark, or believed they were the last soul left in it. Richard pressed his back to the cold steel wall, fingers tightening around his Glock. Rex didn't growl anymore, he dropped low to the floor. Ears flat, eyes locked ahead, as if counting the intruder's every breath. The flashlight blinked again, then vanished. A metallic click echoed, the third door. Just 10 paces from where Richard stood. He leaned toward Rex and whispered. Left flank. Silent. Rex melted into the shadows like a ghost programmed for war. Richard moved to the edge of the doorway. Took a deep breath. His heartbeat slowed, falling into the rhythm known only to those who'd walked into death without letting breath betray position. That's when another hand opened a door behind him. No need to hide. Sarge. The voice, low, steady, rang out with a familiar tone that chilled Richard to his spine. He spun, gun raised. A flashlight beamed into his face, then slowly dropped. A tall man stood there in a gray tactical jacket, close-cropped silver hair, and over his chest, the Omega K-9 insignia. Been a long time, the man said. Thought you were dead. Richard didn't lower his gun. Major Grant, I was hoping you were buried in Kandahar. Grant gave a small laugh, but there was no humor in his eyes. I didn't die. I just changed direction. By betraying the whole program? No, Sarge, I just chose the right side. From another hallway, Rex emerged, teeth bared. Stepping between them, he didn't lunge, but his growl was deep enough to tear the silence in two. Grant stared at Rex for a long moment. He's still loyal to you? Surprising. I thought these dogs only stayed loyal to their first handler. Richard's voice was steel. No, they're loyal to what's right. And you're the kind of thing they'll take down if they have to. A tight second passed. Then a faint sound. Kaiser let out a soft whine from across the room. Grant's eyes flicked to the source. Oh, Kaiser's still alive? Then what I brought might be pointless now. Richard's finger tightened on the trigger. But Grant raised a hand. I'm not here to shoot. I came to negotiate. Negotiate what? You give me the USB. I get you and your 3 dogs out of here. No deaths. No court-martials. Everyone walks. Richard laughed. A bitter, broken laugh. The kind forged under airstrikes and false promises from command. We were abandoned once. Not again. So you're choosing to fight? Grant took a half-step back. In this frozen tunnel, with an injured dog and a USB no one's going to rescue you for? I'm choosing truth, even if it means dying under snow and mud. Rex growled louder. Grant stepped back. And then, he vanished into the dark. No footstep. No shot. Just a final sentence. Rusted and cold. Next time, There won't be a negotiation. And I won't be alone. Sarge. Richard stood frozen for a moment longer. Rex returned to his side. No fear. No command needed. Only a look, one that said, "You chose the right path. And I'm going with you to the end." Richard knelt and placed his hand on Rex's head. "It's begun, soldier." 2 a.m. Deep inside the frozen tunnel. No wind could reach them, yet the cold still seeped from the steel walls. As if the ghosts of old military orders were breathing from within. Richard lit another fire, warming Kaiser, his aging comrade now drifting further toward the edge. But this time, Kaiser's eyes weren't cloudy. His body was weak, yes, but those eyes still burned with a soldier's spirit. A gaze that told Richard, "You're not allowed to give up." Rex didn't sleep. He stood sentinel at the tunnel door. Unmoving, unblinking, just listening. Richard stared at the USB in his hand. The one Major Grant was willing to chase into hell to retrieve. Part of him wanted to destroy it. But the other part, the one forged in sand and gunfire, where oaths meant survival, knew the truth had to make it to Fort Drum. No matter what. Around 3 a.m., Rex shot up. No growl, no warning, just a blur of motion as he lunged toward the northern corridor, once sealed by a steel door. Now, slightly ajar, Richard grabbed his M4, slung the pack across his shoulders, wrapped Kaiser in a pre-folded blanket, strapped on the rifle, secured the USB inside his inner coat, and ran. His headlamp swept the tunnel ahead, catching Rex at full speed, never looking back, never hesitating. And then, they heard it. A growl. But not Rex's. And not human. It was a dog's growl. But not from any dog they'd ever known. No companion's breath. No familiar nail clicks. Just cold, mechanical movement. Like something programmed to replace what could never truly be replaced. Rex halted at a junction. Ears perked. Back arched. A low rumble in his chest. Richard raised his rifle. Then, from the darkness ahead, two red eyes appeared. Not a dog. A semi-biological tactical unit. A classified weapon. One banned from active war zones. Only one man had clearance to activate it. Major Grant. Richard stepped back. "Rex, do not engage. Fall back." But Rex didn't fall back. He stepped forward. Steady. Locked eyes with the thing designed to replace him and every K9 soldier like him. A leap. A roll. And the battle began. Richard shouted, shielding Kaiser in a crevice and firing at the tactical unit's guidance sensors. The thing didn't slow. Rex clamped onto its metal knee joint, then was slammed hard into the floor. Blood pooled from his jaw. But he didn't let go. Finally, Richard reached for his last line of defense. A mini EMP grenade, one relic from his final covert op. He hurled it straight at the device's base. Snap. A flash of white light. The unit froze mid-step. Rex rolled clear, panting. Richard rushed over and caught him in his arms. It's okay, Rex, we still have a way out." Behind them, part of the tunnel collapsed. The northern route, gone. But Rex, blood coating his snout, stood again. He licked Richard's hand, his way of saying, "I can still go on." Richard wiped the blood from his mouth. "We can't turn back now." He gripped the USB and shoved it deep into his inner coat. Fort Drum was only 3 checkpoints away. And now, the darkness? Was no longer what he feared. Inside the tunnel, only Rex's heavy breathing, Kaiser's faint whimpers, and Richard's boots echoed, each step like a countdown ticking louder. Ammo nearly gone. EMP grenades. Depleted. Northern exit. Completely collapsed. But in the memory map Richard had memorized like scripture. There remained one last escape. Gate 3, an emergency checkpoint built during the Cold War. Long abandoned, but if the backup generator still functioned, the steel door might open one last time. Rex staggered but kept leading the way. Blood soaked his fur. His shoulder was swollen, but not a single whimper. Not a second of hesitation. The deeper they went, the darker it grew. Richard switched to red light mode, a beam invisible to recon drones and thermal sensors. At the final turn, Richard laid Kaiser down gently. He pulled out the reserve syringe and injected their last morphine dose into the old dog's vein. Just a little longer. Warrior. One more door. Kaiser couldn't respond, but his eyes turned upward, still conscious. Still trusting. Suddenly, from behind, A burst of white light swept across the corridor. Engines. Footsteps. They had arrived. Not one, but 3 tactical units. Tracking the beacon. Grant had no doubt embedded back in the old Omega lab. Richard pulled Kaiser into his chest. Heart pounding. Rex. Go. Gate 3. Now. Rex hesitated. Richard shouted, his voice cutting through the frozen silence like a blade. Move. That's an order. Rex turned and bolted. An arrow loosed into darkness. Richard clutched Kaiser tighter, drew his Glock. Down the corridor, a figure emerged, gray tactical coat. Grant. It's over. Sarge. He called. The USB. Hand it over. I'll let you all walk away. Richard squinted down the sight. You still don't get it, do you, Grant? The moment you brought that mechanical dog down here, your game ended. We're not afraid of you anymore. Grant stepped forward, hand rising. But then, a high-pitched siren echoed from afar. Gate 3. Opening. Not Rex. Someone activated the system from outside. A voice crackled in Grant's radio. Commander Grant. Unknown signals from the eastern outpost. Reinforcements inbound. Grant cursed under his breath. Damn it, she's alive. Sarah. In that split second, Richard flung the USB across the corridor, into a gas conduit leading straight to Gate 3. Rex, without hesitation, lunged forward, caught the USB in his mouth, and sprinted down the hall like wildfire. Grant raised his weapon on instinct. Richard shot first. The blast cracked through the tunnel like thunder. Rex vanished around the bend. Kaiser stirred faintly in Richard's arms, understanding, somehow, that the mission had passed to the next soldier. Grant was wounded, but still standing. Richard gently laid Kaiser down and rose to his feet. If you want to live, Grant, walk away. If not, I won't miss this time. Grant stared at him, gaze like rusted nails. You're the same as ever. Loyal to a ghost. Richard gave a tired smile. No, we're loyal to something you never had the courage to understand. Far off. Gate 3 fully unlocked. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it light and footsteps. Sarah. Alive. Flanked by a small reinforcement team. Richard collapsed, not from injury, but from knowing the fight hadn't been for nothing. Rex placed the USB gently at Sarah's feet. He whimpered, then sat upright. Blood dripping down his flank but posture unbroken. Sarah looked at Rex, then at Richard. We're not done yet, but now, we finally have a chance. Cold wind howled through the mouth of the tunnel as Gate 3 fully opened. Snow poured in, covering the steel floor like a burial shroud. But Richard no longer felt the cold. Not after seeing Sarah step in, alive, unscathed, her eyes still burning with the fire of someone who never surrendered. Behind her were 2 Fort Drum soldiers in combat uniforms, carrying a stretcher and medical gear. But what moved Richard wasn't the backup. It was Rex's gaze, looking at Sarah, then back at Richard, a look that said, the mission is complete. And now, all he wanted was to stay with the ones he loved. Kaiser was carefully placed on the stretcher and injected with heart stimulants. One of the soldiers caught the number etched on the ID tag around his neck. Oh my God, this is K9022. He was declared Kia in Kandahar, 2019. Sarah turned to Richard. He never left me. Even when abandoned, even when injured, he chose to stay. Richard clenched his jaw, then rested his hand on Kaiser's head, firm, steady, warm, a thank you that needed no words. Rex remained standing, no stretcher, no collapse. But Sarah noticed the wound on his front leg, where blood had soaked through the thick fur. He needs surgery. Immediately. Richard nodded. I'm going with him. But just as the team prepared to withdraw, a voice rang out, harsh and ragged. Drop your weapons. Grant. No longer hiding in shadows, he was perched on the cliff above. Having followed a secondary vent out toward the snowy ravine. Gun raised, eyes bloodshot. A man once convinced of his own invincibility, now reduced to the last bitter remnant of a rotting ideal. You're not leaving with that USB. Grant hissed. I lost my entire career for what's in there. And I swear, I won't let you bring it into the light. Sarah stepped in front of Rex and Richard. Protective, unflinching. Richard rose, not armed, not armored, just steady and unshaken. Grant, he said slowly, we don't need to shoot you. The border surveillance has already logged the entire chase. You've lost. End this. Grant shook his head. No, Richard. I only lose if I let you live. He raised the gun. Bang! A single shot cracked the air. Grant collapsed into the snow. Not by Richard. Not by Sarah. But by the Fort Drum soldier behind him. The one who recognized the abused emblem of their fallen unit and made a decision in a heartbeat. The silence that followed was heavy, like a national mourning. Sarah bowed her head. Richard did not close his eyes. He simply stared at the lifeless body. He used to be my commander. Richard murmured. And I once believed he'd die for us. Sarah answered softly. There are some who only live in the shadow of power. But then, there are those like you. Like Rex. Like Kaiser. Who live so that truth won't be buried. Rex walked up and rested his head on Richard's thigh. Still alive. Still fighting. And more than anything, still loyal. Loyal in a way that can't be programmed. And can't be bought. As the pink light of dawn crept over the mountain ridge, the group began to move. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had left the tunnel behind. But it was within that darkness that the light was found. In the hearts of those who never betrayed. 2 weeks after the events at Gate 3, Fort Drum was more alive than it had been in years. Not because of a military drill. Not because of a visiting general. But because of a public hearing, the first of its kind in U.S. military history. A special tribunal, held for 3 four-legged soldiers, Rex, Kaiser, and Bruno. In the front row, Richard sat between Sarah and Colonel Munro, the very man who once kept the Omega K9 project hidden from the world. But now was the one to request that the data from the USB Rex had carried out of hell be released to the public. On a modest platform set up in the hall, the 3 dogs sat side by side. Kaiser, receiving steady medication, his eyes bright despite his rear leg in a brace. Bruno, the former bomb detection dog, now calm and still as an old general. And Rex, standing tall, freshly groomed, a medal of honor hanging around his neck. His eyes didn't flinch, didn't scan for cover. They stared straight into the crowd, as if he were speaking on behalf of all the nameless warriors who were never recognized. When Colonel Munro took the podium, the hall fell silent. In over 30 years of service, I've seen men lay down their lives for their brothers. But never before have I witnessed loyalty like what these 3 showed at Tunnel 3. He opened a steel box, removed the encrypted USB, and placed it on the table. This contains proof of illegal experimentation on service dogs, forced behavioral chips, and a record of missions manipulated for personal gain. It was all covered up. Until a dog decided it would no longer stay silent. A spotlight turned toward Rex. The room rose to its feet in applause. When it was Richard's turn at the mic, he brought no notes, only one hand, resting gently on Rex's head. I used to be a Marine. I've lost friends. I've lost faith. And I thought I couldn't fight another battle. He paused, voice low, steady. Then Rex came. He didn't ask who I used to be. Didn't need a reason. He just walked beside me. Through mud, through blood, through the long night. And when I collapsed, he bit into a dream I had forgotten. And dragged me back. The room went still, as if their hearts had been seized. I'm not here to tell a story of glory. I'm here to say, it's time we stop treating these beings as tools. They're teammates, brothers, soldiers. Applause broke out, not in rhythm, but like something bursting out of people's chests. At the end of the hearing, a new plaque was mounted at Fort Drum's memorial wall. Omega Unit. We never leave each other behind. Beneath it, the names of the 3 canine warriors were engraved. And beside them, a line etched in cold steel. They did not speak, but they taught us what it means to be silent. And still remain loyal to the end. Rex sat in front of the plaque and gently licked Richard's hand. No applause was needed. No glory sought. Only this. To know that this time, no one was left behind. Spring came late to Fort Drum. The snow hadn't fully melted. But the sun began rising earlier, casting soft golden light over the steel fences and faded rooftops of the base. On the southern lawn, once the old K9 training field, a large flag had been raised. Tall, wide, simple, every stitch hand sewn by veterans who once served beside Richard. At its center, the silhouettes of 3 dogs standing side by side. Beneath one hand-embroidered line, loyal silence echoes farther than any gunfire. Richard sat on a wooden bench beneath a row of willows, left hand around a coffee mug, right hand relaxed at his side, where Rex lay stretched out. One leg still bandaged, but his eyes were sharp, unwavering, just as they had been the first day they met on that frozen base. Kaiser had been placed in long-term care at a specialized recovery center for retired K-9 veterans. His condition had stabilized. Whenever Richard visited, Kaiser always tried to lift his head, as if some mission still remained unfinished. Bruno, now the grumpy old man of the rookie squad, had technically been retired. But he refused to stay out of training. One whistle, and Bruno would step forward to instruct the younger dogs. With a low, seasoned growl that meant, "Watch, learn." Hundreds of articles had been written. The story spread across social media like wildfire. Rex, the lone K-9 who exposed a military secret. But Richard didn't care about headlines. What brought tears to his eyes was an old postcard from a veteran in Alabama. The handwriting shook. "I didn't believe we mattered anymore. But because of that dog, I remembered what we fought for. Thank you." On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as the sun brushed the mountain ridge, Sarah arrived, no longer in uniform, just a clay-colored sweater, a leash in hand. Beside her trotted a black puppy, with oversized ears and a love for crunching dry leaves. "His name's Scout," Sarah said, "born from one of the retired dogs at the old training camp. Some say, Scout's the beginning of the next generation." Richard smiled, bending to scratch Scout's head. "He'll learn from the best." Rex looked over, then slowly rose, limping forward. No bark, no growl, just a quiet touch, his nose to the pup's forehead. A transfer of duty, not in words, but in the spirit shared by those who had walked through darkness and chose to return to the light. Months later, in a quiet ceremony just outside Fort Drum's fence, they planted an oak tree beside a plaque bearing the names of the 3 dogs. No loudspeakers, no media, just Richard, Sarah, a few old comrades, and children from the nearby town. One small boy reached out, touching the engraved stone, whispering, "Were they superheroes?" Richard knelt down, nodding. Yes, but not because they were strong. Because they never left anyone behind. Even when the world left them. That evening, as the sky turned to indigo, Rex lay by the steps, his head resting on Richard's leg. The breeze was light. No more gunfire. No more orders. Only the peace they had fought for, with everything they had. And in that silence, you know what? They were still there. No need for words. Still loyal. Still guarding. And still choosing to love.